Hello, I'm Charlotte Leisman. Welcome back to the Gothic Literary Society. Today we are talking about the differences between Gothic and horror. So if you've been watching the Gothic genre lately, you know there's been some crossover between Gothic and horror writing. And traditionally, if you have perhaps seen my video on terror versus horror, you know that traditionally Gothic writing featured almost exclusively terror rather than horror. However, there has been a little bit of change, a little bit of move towards horror in more recent years. However, today we are going to talk more about traditional Gothic writing, which is still in play. So a lot of Gothic writers, for example, say Sarah Waters or others, do employ more of the traditional terror rather than horror. And we're going to talk about that versus the horror genre and what to expect. So if you're like me, occasionally you pick up a book and you look at the book and it has everything you might expect in a Gothic book. It's got, some old house or buried family secrets and a sense of isolation, dark and stormy weather, all that sort of thing. It might even have vampires, and you think, okay, it has to be Gothic. But if you're like me, you read the book and or watch the movie, if it's a movie, and you realize it's not all that Gothic. So that's what we're going to talk about today, are the differences between Gothic and horror and how to know what it is you're watching, or if you're a writer, how to know what you're writing, and if you want to write either Gothic or horror, how to know what to put in your book. So the first thing to look at when you're trying to understand whether it is Gothic or horror is the theme. And the themes of the two genres are actually very, very different. So the horror genre always features something of a specific moral failing, and that moral failing could be on the part of the protagonist. So perhaps it is a long buried part of his past that is catching up to him, and he's going to have to deal with it, or very often other characters are going to have to deal with it in order to be free from whatever the consequences are of that past. Or it could be a failing on the part of another character, or perhaps even a global entity. So, for example, if you've read Robert McGammon's book Swan Song, you know that the specific moral failing was on the part of the US government and the global government as a whole. So they have initiated nuclear war, and of course there are a lot of very terrible consequences that ensue after that happens, and the characters are left to deal with the consequences of that. And there are other personal moral failings on behalf of the various antagonists throughout the book. But as a thematic whole, the sum of the book is dealing with the consequences of this moral failing on the part of the government. So something very specific. On the other hand, if you look at Gothic writing, you're going to see themes that are very, very global. So themes that deal with a very universal question, but it's going to be something intangible, something dealing very much with the spiritual or the psychological world. So for instance, you might be looking at some of the questions. We'll look at Wuthering Heights and in the very near future and talk about some of the inordinate affections from Heathcliff and the consequences of that. You could have books that deal with eternality of love, and I don't mean just a romance story. I mean perhaps a look into the afterlife and whether love actually prevails after death. So that would be a very Gothic question, because of course we cannot reason that. None of us have died and taken a look at whether the love, and in this case I'm talking about just specific romantic love between two people, or it could be some other form, whether that love actually prevails and endures after death. So those are the sorts of questions that you would expect in a Gothic book. Those are very universal, very global questions dealing with a very intangible matter. So, for example, if you were to look at two of Stephen King's books, one is Gothic and one is horror. For the horror example, I have chosen Needful Things. So in the book, if you've read it or seen the movie, you know that there is a shopkeeper. He symbolizes something like the devil, and he comes to town and he is offering the various residents of this town their greatest desires, and on the surface they are getting them for basically for free. And of course each person is choosing, we discover very quickly, choosing something based on a personal secret or perhaps not so secret failing, some form of secret sin that that person has. And as the book continues, the residents are having to deal with the terrible, terrible consequences because, of course, none of these things are actually free. There is a debt that has to be paid, and they are dealing with the consequences of the things that they thought they had to have. So these needful things. And they are pitting themselves against one another, and it is becoming more and more violent, and there are a lot of consequences to that level of greed, and it all stems from their very specific, very personal moral failings, and we get to know a lot about what those are. So unlike Swan Song, where we saw the moral failing of a separate entity, the government, in Needful Things we see the very moral failings of the very specific characters, so throughout the book. On the other hand, if you've read Stephen King's book Salem's Lot, you know that a vampire comes to Salem, which is short for Jerusalem, and he comes there and he is feeding off of the residents and destroying them. And the theme of that book is that those who deny the existence of evil are the most vulnerable to it. So, of course, throughout the book, the people who refuse to admit what's going on in their town are the ones who are destroyed, and the ones who are willing to admit that there is evil and are willing to conquer their fears and rise up to challenge it are the ones who prevail in the end. So that kind of theme, the existence of evil, or you could look at it another way, you could say perhaps the vulnerability when we are not willing to admit that it exists and we aren't willing to stand up to it. That's a very global theme. That doesn't deal necessarily with a very specific failing. So not surprisingly, in that book, in Salem's Lot, King doesn't give us a whole lot of information about all of the different towns' residents' personal moral failings, because it's just not relevant in a Gothic book. It's just not important. Of course, they all have moral failings because everyone does, but in a Gothic sphere, that's just not the primary focus. So that's the difference on a thematic level. So in contrast, you could also look at the use of the tropes. So you're very often going to see very similar tropes between the Gothic sphere and the horror sphere, which also makes it more confusing, more difficult to determine what it is you're reading or watching. And they're used quite differently, even though they look quite similar. So you might even have things like vampires or werewolves or things that you think are explicitly Gothic. Those can show up in the horror sphere as well, along with all of the usual, the dark and stormy atmosphere and the madness, or, you know, old crumbling castles and that sort of thing. However, in the horror sphere, whereas you have a very specific moral failing, whether it's on the part of the main character or on the part of someone else, you have tropes that are applied very globally. So, for instance, you might have a crumbling house, and that crumbling house is simply meant to create this sense of oppression, and it doesn't necessarily parallel anything that's going on within the main character. And you might have dark and stormy weather, and it's really creating just this heavy weight over the character and over the reader that is pushing the main character or characters into a corner where they have to address them and attempt to prevail over them in the end. In contrast, in the Gothic sphere, whereas you have a very global, very intangible theme, you have very, very specific tropes. So in the Gothic sphere, you might have a crumbling house or a crumbling castle or whatever it is, but there it will mean something. It will parallel, perhaps it parallels the main character's belief system. Perhaps he has a belief system that he is struggling to hold on to, and it was never rooted in any truth, and it's not a good belief system, and it is falling down around him, and the house is symbolizing that. It is making that very manifest. So I wrote an article not too long ago on how Gothic writing makes the B plot tangible, so you can check that out if that helps a little bit more. But you're going to see something like that. And for another example, I recently wrote a book, a Gothic book, which features many Gothic tropes. Of course, it has the old estate, it has the dark and stormy weather and family secrets and all that sort of thing, but it also features a ghost. And on the surface, the ghost is the main character's aunt who has come back from the dead to haunt her. But of course, symbolically, in the Gothic sphere, a ghost will always mean something. It should mean something if you're reading a Gothic book. Otherwise, you should question whether it's really just horror that you're reading. So in the Gothic sphere, this ghost, the way I've used it is her inner portion of herself that she is hiding from others and from herself. So she is not willing to face a large portion of herself and a part of her history, actually quite a few parts of her history. And by doing this, I'm using this very tangible feature, this ghost, side by side with the main character, so that readers can see her manifest self and her hidden self side by side. That helps readers to understand a theme that is very, very intangible. And so in the Gothic sphere, expect this use of very specific tropes that are paralleling the inner state of the character, along with your very global theme. So to summarize, expect in the horror sphere, expect this very specific moral failing and these global tropes, and in the Gothic sphere, expect very global theme and very specifically applied tropes. So hopefully that's helpful. I will provide a chart with a couple of examples if that is helpful for you to take that away. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this video. That's it for today. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell. That way you'll be notified every time I release a video. I post videos on Fridays. So until next time, stay undead, my friends.